Bienvenue, welcome one and all to another one of my live streams. I'm very pleased to have with me in the studio Chris Gilsenan of Root Home, and myself, of course, of the Many Purple Hats. And today, I think we're talking a little bit more about a topic we've touched on in the past, I think. And we're talking perhaps about how investors are protecting assets. Yes, and I think, and this has all been promoted by a conversation you had with a pensions and tax expert. Would you acquaint me with that and how it went?
Yeah, absolutely. Was speaking with a really interesting chap yesterday called Andrew Wood over at Business Class UK, and we were talking about pensions, about different ways of holding assets. So, um, most property investors will or may have heard of most business owners may have heard of a SAS, a small self-administered scheme where they can take control of their pension. Um, in that, it's normally for limited company owners, and it's normally a consortium of limited company owners, but it doesn't have to be. And they can pool resources. They can do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with it, including getting into some aspects of property, including purchasing, renovating commercial property. One of the things they can't do is hold residential property. Um, but other weird and wonderful things they can do is like lend money out of the SAS to third parties, so non-related third parties as well, up to about 25%. Well, no, sorry, 50% of the
Are you
SAS
saying
value.
you become a bank, if you will, of
You
sorts?
become your own bank. Yes, yes, using your pension funds and taking control of your pension funds to see where they're invested, rather than placing them in the hands of a pension manager who will put them in normally into index funds or normally low level, low return funds. So yeah, gives you full control of your pension. Now, there are some limits on SASs, so they can only grow to a certain amount before you then need something else.
Right.
And there are limits on what you can and can't hold in that SAS. So I mentioned residential property being a big stumbling block for lots of investors or lots of people looking to invest into property. Having conversations with Andrew yesterday, um, he mentioned the next thing, which I had heard of very briefly, but then didn't really know anything about. And the next step up from the SAS is called the QNUP, where there isn't any limits. There isn't any limits on what you can put in there, what you
Wow.
hold, or the value of the pension. So yeah, it's just interesting conversations that I'm having with people all the time, and trying to understand. I guess what you're really trying to understand is what is the end game. For me, for example, property isn't my pension. That's my end game, to hold assets that I can live off ultimately after I hit a certain age. Still benefit from those in the meantime as well. So I guess they're one part of the puzzle for my personal circumstances, and I just find it interesting where to have a slightly cynical perspective that the system is rigged. The
N-
system, we know this, right? The
We
system
never
is rigged.
we've never had a cynical perspective, Chris. You and I.
The system
Right.
is set up by people who they've created the system, and there are loopholes in the system. So when you uncover one of these loopholes that these individuals use, it's fascinating to see how they work and how they can be adapted and work for you.
If I
And
can run with your analogy of loopholes, I'm a bit worried that when you tug at one loophole, it all falls apart like a cheap pullover. Um,
well, Andrew did mention yesterday that the precursor to the QNUPs were QROPs, which were a pension facility to allow people moving across different geographical regions to allow them to port their UK pension over as well,
right.
to comply with EU law. And apparently, he mentioned a number of elements that were abused, shall we say, in that precursor.
You give people loopholes, somebody's going to tie them all together and make one big hole. Um,
There's always naughty people.
well, yes, and it's kind of part of the human condition. I don't think you can ever fully get away from it. All right, good. So what you're saying is there's actually some really interesting things you can do while at the same time uh improving your position by lending out money from within one of these financial instruments? Is that what it
They
is?
are tax efficient wrappers. So, for example, um, a couple of things that Andrew mentioned yesterday was the QNOPs. It instantly mitigates inheritance tax instantly. So there's no waiting 7 years. You put your assets into this, and
You're
that's
done.
it. Inheritance tax is dealt with.
But if you put your assets into that, they're not directly available to you, but you can lend them out, which then accrues interest.
If you have capital in there, you could use that capital to go and invest into bigger assets. But
But
the
you
the
could actually
critical
you could put assets into it, but you can't put a domestic dwelling in there. You could put a commercial. I'm
That,
sorry. I'm
that's yeah. No, it gets complicated. So for the SASs you can't. For the
right.
QNOPs you can. You can put anything in. So,
Right.
for example, Andrew mentioned yesterday you could put fine wines in or classic cars in there. But remember, the point of the pension is it's meant to benefit you in later years. It's meant to support you in later years.
Right.
So there are some caveats to using it, which is why I say it's one of a few financial instruments that you would want in your arsenal, and one that you're using to plan for later years. So, for
What
example,
sort of caveats are we talking about? Come on,
the
scare me.
critical ones, you can't. It's your pension, so you can't take it out until you're of pensionable age. So you can draw your pension when you are of pensionable age, but when you put the assets in, it's in. So the capital, the asset is locked in there. You
Does
could
it stop functioning when you hit pensionable age?
no, no.
Right. And hang on, if it's within the pension, the QNUP, QPAP, QFLAP, whatever, once it's in there and you're not touching it, can
Mhm.
you live off the benefits it's giving you through either accruing interest or through providing, for instance, if this buys a classic car, can you drive that classic car?
In theory, yes. I don't see why not.
If
Yeah.
it
So there,
buys your commercial a commercial series of properties, could
mhm.
you then use one of those commercial properties as your own office and rent the rest out to likely parties, for instance?
There's no reason why not. I mean, you could charge yourself a nominal rent, a pound, peppercorn rent, and so yeah, there's some consideration there. Yeah, absolutely. I don't see why not. But again, I'm not a financial advisor. I don't know for
No,
sure.
no, no,
I
no,
was
and
only
we're not.
having this conversation yesterday, and I've got questions as well. So, for example, one that I want to know, that's just popped into my head is, well, what happens when you die? Can I put the pension into trust?
Is it willable?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. So loads of weird and wonderful things. You've got a huge asset base, so you want to make sure that that's then passed down the generations.
Yeah, you don't want it going to the crown, no, do you?
Hell no.
Uh, all right, all right, all right. So we've established that these things mean that your assets can become very tax efficient
Mm.
because you've mitigated the moment you use QNUPs. QNUPs? All right.
QNOPs, yes.
Right.
Don't
You
ask me what it stands for.
one of those many and varied different uh, uh, series of letters and numbers. That most people have no idea what they mean, but what it seems to mean overall is that you can absorb into it a number of assets which could benefit you once you're a pensionable age, but theoretically could be passed on either to the next generation or even become could they become part of a business?
Mhm.
Could they be owned by the business?
You could
Could the
have
QNUPs
assets.
be
Yeah.
owned by the business?
You could have businesses that the QNOPs owns the shareholdings to. Yeah, yeah. So there's
Wow.
it's knowing what you want to achieve. So and it's really difficult as well, starting with the end in mind. So, for example, starting from a standing still position, it's like, well, the starting position is, well, I'd like to get out of the day job. That's normally the first step for most people.
Well, yes, of course.
How do I
Isn't
do
that
that
for us all?
first?
Isn't that for us
Mm,
all? Go on.
yeah, and then it's how do you build your asset base off the back of that? But then you start thinking, well, how do I then protect that asset base? Protect it primarily from the tax burdens from being squandered, from making sure it's passed down through your generations, and
Mm,
to some extent,
mm.
your what you'd like to happen with it being passed down with it. Those sorts of instructions, although you obviously you can't guarantee anything after you die. Um, so yeah, it's knowing where you're trying to take, I guess, your life, your financial planning, and it is super complicated. People know they want to get into property because it's a vehicle to some sort of financial freedom, and knowing how they then go about it, that's the complicated part. So having conversations with people like Andrew, absolutely invaluable. It's very important that people are aware that there are other options on the horizon for them, rather than building up an asset base in your own personal name or in a limited company name, and then when you die, you have to give the crown 40%.
Which is crazy. Um,
It's a hideous tax. Yeah, so you pay tax on all those assets all the way through your life, and then you're expected to then pay it again
Hey,
when
a
you
bit
die.
more. Yes, we
Ridiculous.
haven't rung enough through your nose already. We need to ring a little bit more.
Yeah.
Although, if we're going to talk briefly about the effects of that particular tax, that particularly insidious onerous tax, um, some people, he says, putting on his devil advocate hat, this his looking, trying to see things from both sides, say that, I mean, in the last count, and I've heard this trotted out a number of times, most of the people that would be hit by inheritance tax have already mitigated it, 7-year old and all the rest of that stuff.
There are some thresholds.
Although there is a cost to setting all that up in place anyway, so, you know, it's not free.
No, no, it's not. But it's also worth bearing in mind that I think Charles opted to pay no inheritance tax on the Crown estate.
He opted. How nice of him to opt that.
So if he can, well, if he can opt out, why can't we?
We're commoners, Chris. It's not for the likes of you and I. We don't have enough of the right coloured blood running in our veins. Um, all right. So other than what's good for the goose is good for the gander, which is what you're basically saying, of the ones that are least likely to have done anything about it, most of their properties don't hit the threshold.
Um, possibly, possibly. I mean, there's it's
For
always worth.
for multiple property owners, for multiple landlords with say more than 2 properties in there, of course, they're gonna be hitting that threshold. S these kind of instruments sound like a no-brainer to me.
They are. Yeah, they are. I mean, for things like even hit your limits, things like your personal private residence is not included in the threshold anyway. Um, so yeah, we are talking about people with some assets, some assets. So 3, 4, 5 houses. You're gonna those will quickly scale up to be hitting those thresholds. So yeah, it's even if you're looking at property as a means of escape, as a means of substituting or replacing your income, yeah, you need to be having these conversations, or just be aware that there are people out there who can help mitigate that burden. Certainly the tax burden, but also in terms of your estate planning and what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve overall. Yeah, and like I say, it's not a one size fits all. It's not a you've got to do it this way and you've got to have it in limited companies and then you die. There are all sorts of trusts and pensions and other sorts of schemes that are accessible and are available. But yeah, if you're not open to learning about them, then you're going to just follow the pattern of
Well,
doing what everyone else does and the crown taking it.
you know what they say, if you do the same thing you've always done, you're gonna get what you always got.
Mhm.
I wasn't even aware that these sort of schemes were available to the likes of you and me.
Yeah.
I thought it was only the super rich, the super wealthy who moved in Guernsey and Jersey and so on, and the UAE and Dubai and so on, that would had the availability of such methods of mitigating what is an onerous tax burden.
Yes.
But here we have What was QNUPs? What was the other one? The other version?
The small self-administered scheme, the SAS, normally for company owners. But yeah, the QNUPs, I could even suggest it for lots of the landlords that have built portfolios over the last 40 years or so, and now being hit with all sorts of burdens. I'd suggest having conversations with people like Andrew Wood, who might be able to offer a solution.
Well, Andrew Wood, if you're listening, thank you for that piece of advice. Maybe we should have Andrew Wood on, and he can give us an eye-opening view as to how this can affect
Mm,
people like yourselves and
yeah,
also and others. But thank you so much for bringing it up, Chris. I
pleasure.
really enjoyed that today. I think we'll end on that. But thank you so much for anyone listening. As you can see, we are trying to push the boundaries of what you might normally think about as far as the landlord, the and tenant discussions. And part of that is how, as a landlord, you can mitigate your hard-earned wealth. But until the next time we talk, it should be next week. I wish you all happy hunting. I hope you have a marvelous weekend and, of course, safe mental health. Thank you so much, Chris. Bye bye now.